welcome both to iron out the sound problems here. Welcome both to the fall lecture series and to the lecture you're about to hear. The series itself is pretends to be, I think, quite an exciting and interesting series of talks. The charge is perhaps for many of us the kind of ultimate charge that architecture can, or issue that architecture itself can engage in, which has to do with the issue of space. We've broadened it to include both art and also to those who comment on both architecture and art. The title of the series, Changing Concepts of Space in Art and Architecture, or I think we put it in proper order, Architecture and Art, perhaps could also be reworded and better stated as Changing Manifestations of Space in Architecture and Art, because of course it's not concepts finally that we're most interested in, but the reality of it. We've included three artists, two critics, one of art and one of architecture, and two architects and a teapot designer. We're trying to bracket the series with the two critics. The art critic will not quite be at the end, I think. I would like to let the two people responsible for organizing and thinking of this series, Kathy Lindstrom and Stephen Spear, wherever they are, introduce tonight's speaker.
First of all, there's a reception afterwards over in the graduate annex. Hope you all attend. I would like to thank Dworsky Associates, John Jurdy, Rossville, and Nadell for their help in the series. Special thanks to Dean Harris for his cooperation over at USC, and Mr. Robert. Tonight's speaker is Alberto Pérez-Gómez, who until recently was director at the Carleton University School of Architecture in Ottawa, Canada. He's taught all over the place in this country as well as at the AA in London, and has lectured extensively. Undergraduate degree in architecture and engineering in Mexico City, and postgraduate work at Cornell, and he has a Master of Arts and a PhD from the University of Essex, England. His rather controversial book, Architecture and the Crisis of Modern Science, was awarded the Alice Davis Hitchcock Award. And the latest news is that he is going to be a visiting professor with an endowed chair at McGill University in Montreal. Welcome.
Work okay like that? Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I'm flattered by your presence. I hope you bear with me, and lectures are strange things. They are very personal. I really hope to have the opportunity to say a few words. Don't turn off the lights yet. Well, you have to, yes. I mean, with this media. But I'm going to make a sort of lengthy introduction. I don't need the slides for the time being, so you don't mind. What I was saying is I hope I can get you a little bit after the lecture, and perhaps you can ask me some questions and I can clarify some of my points of view. I am obsessive when I lecture. I must warn you, and I try to say too many things. but hopefully I will keep you entertained. I thought that to talk about perspective would fit well the broad concern that is going to be examined in your lecture series, because hopefully it will become apparent to you that on touching upon perspective, one is touching also upon the transformation between what I would call the spatiality, which engages man in the world through embodiment in traditional culture, to the potential concept of space that emerges in 17th century philosophy and ultimately becomes a popular belief in the 19th century, and the concern of architects, of course, in the 19th century. You know that architects never spoke about space as a conscious phenomenon of perception until the 19th century, until Schmarzov, in fact. So first, remind yourself of this fact. I think it's important that Bruno Sevi had it all wrong. I mean, it's a very nice introduction, this business of space and concepts of space in wherever, Greece, Rome. But the truth of the matter is that architects, if you look at what they wrote and what they were thinking about, were never conscious about the phenomenon of space as something out there with geometrical characteristics until the 19th century. For me, therefore, to talk about perspective and the transformation between perspective as an illusion, a legitimate illusion in the 17th century, as I will try to show you, and a delusion in the 19th century, is closely related to this problem, and we'll see how it goes. I guess every person that comes here to talk maybe opens his speech by saying that there is something about modern architecture which has failed, that the contemporary city, in fact, is problematic because it doesn't speak to man about himself, because it is mute, because it is sterile, because somehow it doesn't convey the imagery that traditional cities conveyed. I agree 100%. I think this is a great problem that we have, a difficulty in actually building architecture in our cities. A difficulty which, if I may sort of make a few general comments as an introduction before I talk about the specifics of the subject matter, a difficulty which entails, as you know if you have heard Peter Eisman lecture on the subject, although of course the conclusion is very different from my standpoint, which entails facing a world of simulations like these television cameras, yes, which now you will have in your library and will be better than my lecture. Facing a world of simulations, because that's the only way that we can regain any sense of fascination, any sense of wonder in the space of our cities. A very tough problem, as we all know from experience. I guess as an initial footnote, I would also tend to say that I don't believe that the craze of postmodernism as a stylistic solution to the problem is valid. Reducing the problem of the city to a question of abstraction, like very often our colleague Michael Graves does, and then saying that you can sort of recapture the imagery by putting a few pediments on top of doors and then saying, well, that's really a door, I think it's quite silly. I don't think you regain anything by doing that. One has to somehow take the bull by the horns, and this is hopefully what we are going to be talking about. Of course, the terms are tricky because many, so don't misunderstand me, many anthropologists and historians of art have talked about postmodernity in a sense which is very different from the sort of banal postmodernism of contemporary architecture. And I would like to make that distinction. when postmodernity actually means taking consciousness and understanding the potential of modernity, the potential of what we have created in the last 200 years, I have no qualms with that. I think that's what every artistic endeavor is all about. And when modernity is dismissed because it has failed to do just that, and it has followed certain prejudices engendered in the 17th century, if that's its failure, then I would completely agree. We don't have to discuss. But I think there is a real confusion in terminology, and therefore, well, I just like to say that I don't think that's a solution either. I guess, as maybe most of you know, if you're familiar a little bit with my work, I believe that something very substantial changed in the beginning of the 19th century. The change is complex. I will be alluding to it towards the end of the lecture through the slides. But this change, I would rather like to speak about it as creating the potential, the possibility of an architecture in a realm of not modernism, but post-perspectivity, if I may use that term. Creating the condition of endeavor in the world of art, where I guess the trick notion would be from J. Fellows, the question of the failing distance. And please bear with me for a moment. I just want to introduce some key words that will come back. Perspective, of course, understood in this context as something which truly starts an architectural idea in the 17th century and becomes a fallacy when it becomes identified simply with the reality of the prosaic city in the 19th, and somehow has to be overcome. So let me present my case. I think we all would agree if I told you that the architect must somehow strive to recover meaning in what he makes, in his works, to instill a projection of imagery that recalls the primordial existential grounding of man. I think this is a fundamental constant in architecture and art, I must say. An opening of man to being, yes, and in this I'm sort of straightforward Heideggerian, I guess, and I could elaborate on that afterwards if you wish me to. So that the question about architecture is to make a symbolic order in whichever medium is possible or appropriate in a certain time and space. Having said this, I would also like to put forward the idea that this making, which is a poetic making, this architect's task, must necessarily be a personal dream. It must be personal. And again, you know, I mean, it's a complex problem, particularly accentuated in modernity, in after the beginning of the 19th century. But I would insist that it must be a personal dream. A personal dream which, of course, is grounded on a cultural diagnosis, an understanding of each one of us, of what it means what we do in relation to a totality. This is very crucial, very important. I remember a quotation by a famous Greek philosopher, his name is Heraclitus, you may have heard of him, who wrote, "The hidden harmony is stronger than the visible." And I really very much believe this. And I think that if you look at the history of architecture, real architects, those that have actually had personal visions which eventually become what we call our tradition, are those that have understood their position in relation to a totality very well. So that's, if you like, an articulation through theory and the making. However, this personal vision in this modern world of ours, which is so difficult in this sort of torn condition of modernity, can never be nostalgic. I think that we have, as a humanity, and it's not only that I think it's very obvious, we have opened, if I may put it very rhetorically, a last door. Yes, we are actually facing the abyss. And the last thing we can do as architects is keep on ignoring or trying to look away from the abyss. The abyss has been confronted by philosophers, has been confronted by fantastic artists, but it is seldom confronted by architects. And I think that this is a fundamental problem. Confront the problem of modernity. We have, as I'm going to try to show you with the slides, excluded mythos from legitimate understanding of the world, so that we've made our world rather difficult for ourselves, because everything must be rational, at least so we think. The rest gets buried. Our powers of abstraction, no question about it. We can agree with Michael Graves in this. Are dangerous, and they have certainly led to genocide and ultimately to possible self-destruction. I want to try to show you how, when the modern concept of space finally becomes a belief in the early 19th century, that is indeed a condition for the Industrial Revolution and opens up the door for material control of the world, and obviously at the same time, by allowing wonderful things to happen, who would deny the wonderful things that we have and our freedom vis-a-vis traditional cultures? No one would deny that. But by doing that, it also opens up the realm, opens up the world to nihilism, right? It's very clear, it's very obvious, it has been said many times. And it opens up the possibility for man to commit mass suicide or simply become nothing. However, in spite of this, we must take the bull by the horns, but we must confront the dilemma. We must not elude it. We cannot hide behind the pretense that we are formal manipulators, sort of specialists that make pretty pictures and have no ethical concerns in the world. We cannot hide behind the pretense that we are simply engineers and we are acting in a technically correct way, following very objective principles of either planning or structural determinism or whatever. We simply cannot continue to do that, because if we do that, I don't think that we have reason to exist as architects. Let's forget about it. Let's let that dumb building go on and forget about trying to think that architecture has a future. On the other hand, by the same token, I'm absolutely convinced, otherwise I wouldn't be here, that the potential survival of our culture, the potential survival of this crazy, sort of amazingly exciting world which we have created, is intimately related to our potential to make architecture, to make truly a place for ourselves that talks about our values, not the values of somebody else, not the values of the maiden that died and led to the invention of the Corinthian capital. That's completely ludicrous. Talk about our values and talk and make a world that really speaks back to us and makes us feel at home. So that the challenge, I suppose, put briefly, is to implement this power of abstraction, which we have generated in one way or another through a long expansion of consciousness, probably from the beginning of time, and reconcile it in works that talk about human values, about indeed our mortality, that don't keep on postponing this fundamental question, and that embody a true sense of what we are, what we think of ourselves here and now, rather than sort of giving up this responsibility and pretending that it exists with some other professions, some other cultures, some other computers. It is our responsibility in everything we do. So, again, to recapitulate, a reconciliation of abstraction with the ground of meaning, which ultimately is given in perception, is not invented. And if we have some time at the end and you have the energy, I would be happy to elaborate on that. but that is really the issue. It's not invention or fantasy, but reconciliation of our power of abstraction with the ground of meaning given in perception. Another little footnote as part of my introduction. Society is obviously ambivalent about architecture. I mean, understandably so. I don't think that we can simply say that we make public space, we sort of make it physically, we place 4 little trees, and public life happens. Television always defeats public life, yes? I mean, we obviously have the sense that real public life exists in our bedroom or our living room. And it's a very peculiar form of public life, but that's really what joins us all together. It is no longer any kind of authentic ritual that happens in the public place, which allows the architect to frame that as a cosmic place, like Norbert Schulz would say, and therefore make architecture. Unfortunately, that situation is gone. We cannot take it for granted anymore. Therefore, I don't find it surprising, and this is something that I sort of touch upon in my book, but will become, I think it's important when one talks about an architecture in the realm of post-perspectivity, or addressing the issue of post-perspectivity. Not surprisingly, this architecture generally has not been built. Yes, and I say this with no qualms. I think that it essentially consists in a number of theoretical projects, and I will show you some buildings as well, so you don't think that I don't believe in it. I think that it's possible, but it's difficult. But generally, the most poignant examples that I will show you are theoretical projects that belong to the last 200 years of our history. And start with Piranesi and Boulez, and perhaps end today with the work of John Haydock. I'm going to show you a little bit of that. I guess I believe very, very firmly that one of our terrible preconceptions is to think that architecture is about buildings, and that the history of architecture is the history of buildings. I don't know how we came to believe that. Of course, it's a kind of scientific history that we have inherited from the 19th century. But architecture has been embodied in many ways. You know, I mean, it's actually rather silly. Like I was telling some of the USC students that may be here, and I hope they don't get terribly bored. But it's actually very silly to dissociate, say, the history of landscape as gardens from the history of cities, from the history of buildings, from the history of theory. Ultimately, if the question is a symbolic order, and the question is the understanding of how this symbolic order has operated in history, it's important to realize that the medium has changed from time to time. From the Daedala of the early Greek architects, and if you're interested in that, you can certainly read. I wrote an article about that, published recently in AA Files, to say, for example, stage set designs. You know, I mean, Palladio spends a year of his life really designing for one day, right? For one day in the life of Venice, maybe 2 days. I mean, I don't know any details, how long these celebrations took. But, you know, this was the entrance of some prince, right? And it's very crucial because that the way in which this city is transformed is architecture. It's architecture because it brings out all those symbolic values, and it allows every single individual to belong to an order larger than himself or herself. Yes, transcend mortality and belong to a totality. Doesn't matter that it's canvas and wood, and doesn't really matter that it was destroyed or deteriorated 2 days after the party, right? And we have a damn, I really mean this, you know, it's very upsetting, because I think this is one of the greatest prejudices that somehow make the comprehension of what I say sometimes difficult. A tremendous hang-up about architecture being only about buildings, and the history of architecture being the history of cathedrals, a few houses once in a while, you know, domestic architecture in Europe, and the like. And I think it's a very problematic misunderstanding, and that architecture has its essence, and it can be defined to a certain extent, and it really has had a shifting medium. So I would put it to you that in the last 200 years, in order to make those ideas that are important, and we can only remember how Boulez, for example, who was a greatly successful practicing architect, wrote this treatise, and in the treatise he said, well, I'm writing this treatise because I cannot accept that I am going to devote my life to an art with no principles. And actually, he said, this is my architecture. My architecture is my drawings. Not my buildings. That stuff I had to do. But really, what I'm doing here, my architecture is in these drawings. And he wasn't kidding. It's not a joke. For him, it was a real problem of authenticity. And he meant it. And actually, his architecture, his theoretical projects are fascinating. And they do embody this symbolic order, as you know, if you've read a little bit of my book, particularly concerning the whole Newtonian cosmology. It's there. That is the architecture. He worked on the portrait of Newton, his drafting table. He had a thing of sort of engraving of Newton, a portrait. And for him, this was architecture, not the other stuff. So I think we have to well, this is in any case my position, and having said that, I will now get more specific. So in order to deal with the problem of modernity and what we can do today, I think it's important to realize that the architect is responsible for architectural ideas, which are embodied in different mediums. Now, ideas, I must remind you, are not abstract in that they are disembodied. If you look at the etymology of the word idea, it connotes image. So when you go back to your drafting board and you sort of fool around all night, and you don't do much, and the next day your professor comes and you say, well, what have you done? I say, well, I have some ideas. He's absolutely right if he tells you, go to, forget it, I'm not going to talk to you. You have no ideas. Because ideas have to be there, they have to be made. They have image, they are embodied. And the architect is responsible for such ideas, understood as images. So it's our own misunderstanding that has made it into abstract formulations. Now, what is very interesting to realize is that when Vitruvius, in that book published in the time of Augustus, talks about architectural ideas, he does not talk about perspective at all. For him, the architectural ideas are the plan and the elevation. And then there is a third one, which is very weird, that no historian that I know or specialist has been able to understand, but which implies somehow a volumetric relationship, coherence between that plan and that elevation. But certainly has nothing to do with perspective. Now, why? Why is this? This is the question that I think we must ask ourselves. When does that architectural idea become an architectural idea as perspective? And how do we deal with perspective today? What do we assume it to be? How do we perhaps take it for granted? So I'm going to try to disclose this, to talk about this problem by tracing a history, very brief history of the issue. But perhaps before I just turn off the lights, let me articulate a simple thesis. And maybe if you're very tired and you want to leave, you can leave after that. That's the theoretical. You can take it and sleep on it. The simple thesis is the following: that perspective is not a neutral tool. It is not a neutral tool of representation. It carries reductivist values when it is used innocently, and please mark my words, innocently, to stand for another reality. I find it particularly clear, this business, when you're asked to draw a perspective, or perhaps you're no longer asked to draw perspectives, I don't know, I hope. Maybe not, maybe I'm antiquated. But certainly when I went to school, I was asked to draw perspectives, and the assumption was that this was the way the building looked. And that somehow, if I presented that perspective in a review, that allowed my teacher to have more immediate access into the reality of that building as a represented object. Well, I think this is a tremendous fallacy. I don't think that we can take any drawings like that. I think that one of the worst things that could happen to any of us is to present a project and really have it understood as a predictive tool. So that the implications of perspective go further than just perspective. They obviously have to do with using any other architectural drawing as neutral tools of representation, as tools of reduction. When we believe that no matter what we are designing, the tool is neutral, and we are going to, regardless of what we are designing, we're going to draw a plan and a section and a perspective. And then your professor stands there and criticizes that thing as if it were a building, rather than criticize what is there. I want to put it to you that this peculiar condition has a lot to do with our problems. I'm just going to look at that condition, but it has a lot to do with our malaise and our problems. Our inability to understand that architecture is about making, and that somehow through peculiar conditions that concern our profession and the transformation after the Industrial Revolution, the architect has been put in a position where he has to make believe that he's making, but actually is condemned to stop at the tools of reduction and not be actually involved in making very much. I am convinced that the quality of architecture is directly related to our ability to make it in a direct way, to truly be builders rather than implement a certain idea through a tool of reduction, with the assumption that it's neutral. So I guess a different way of putting this is that indeed the architecture is in what you make. And if what you make in school are drawings, that's the architecture. And it's very important, or models, that's the architecture. And it's very important for you to understand that it's not necessarily crucial that it stands for something else. Whereas today, this is the only value we tend to see in work like that. Okay, so perhaps I'll go back to that, but I'd like to simply emphasize that it has really far-reaching consequences, particularly, I don't think this is rampant in SCI-Arc, but in other architecture schools where computers are big. And SOM comes to the school and shows this film about Chicago, New York, Atlanta, these computers simulated, you go up and down, around, and this is going to make you into better designers. This is the tool of the future. I think that's really, well, it's just one further step of the same nonsense. But I'd like to emphasize this because I think these are the far-reaching consequences which this problem has in that which concerns professional practice. All right. Perhaps we can start the slides, please. Can we turn off the? Should I just push this and they get started, or? That will stay on. Oh yes, of course you're filming. This is actually quite disturbing, I mean, I have spoken in public many times, but that is rather strange. I cannot see you, It's very strange. You become unconscious of the audience. You cannot establish eye contact, and you cannot think the same way. Very strange. But anyhow. All right. So let me trace a brief history of the issues, simply to come back to the beginning of the 19th century and bring you back to the present. The history part will probably be quite brief. I'm not going to dwell into any of this, but the beginning of the problem, the beginning of the question of perspective having something to do with art and the way we see the world, of course, goes back to the very origins of Western philosophy and Western science, and the whole the beginning of the consciousness of the possibility of establishing a theoretical distance. And I'm not going to bore you with this, but I think that in the Greek tragedy and in the Greek theater particularly, it is very clear how this distance is established. You know that the Greek theater originated in the Dionysian ritual, right? I mean, the plays themselves, they were a ritual for Dionysius. And in pre-classical times, everybody had to participate. Everybody had to get drunk. Everybody had to be part of it. With your whole body, you had to participate. There was a whole continuum involved there. In order to understand your position in the world, you had to build a temple and you had to participate. The question of a mythical world is very, it's precisely the same one. In that kind of continuum where the world is alive, talks back to man as you talk to the world, as you engage in the world. There is no discontinuity. I suppose, I cannot move, huh? Cannot move it. The big shift occurs here, where I guess that's why I have this, right? So I don't have to move. Where the audience can now sit there, of course, in the amphitheater, and then you have the actors working on the scene. I mean, not much is left there, but that's where it was. It's a building, and now you can come to the theater and be part of the ritual without participating, just by witnessing, by simply witnessing the will of the gods. So that the Greeks didn't go to the theater for entertainment. They actually went. It was a ritual act, really, to understand their place in the world. It was a very important existential need, so that now you don't have to do it physically, right? You can do it at a distance. The same thing happens, of course, with philosophy vis-a-vis myth. Philosophy establishes this distance and allows an explanation which emphasizes the logos, the logic, as opposed to the mythos, the myth. All right. Now, the important thing here is that in early Greek times, at this point in time, we have the origin of the Western work of art with everything else. I'll give you just one example, so that I don't spend so much time discussing it, and perhaps it becomes clear. In pre-classical Greece, in sort of mythical times, when there was a funerary statue made, there was a funeral monument, the inscription always read, "I am so and so," so that the image was the person. After this time, the inscription always read, invariably, "I am the image," icon. That's the Greek word, right? "I am the image of so and so." So in art as well, there is this unfolding. Yes, it's kind of what philosophers have called a problem of mimesis. It's a kind of unfolding that allows the work of art to stand for the totality of the world in which man is engaged, and therefore be significant. But it establishes a distance. Well, this distance, of course, is the beginning of a perspectival distance. No question about it. Yes, I mean, this is the first disengagement between man as a thinking subject and the world as an objective reality. But of course, this initial disengagement happens in a certain realm, in a very limited way, perhaps for a limited period of time. At the time of the Sophists, this becomes very clear. But then myth takes over again, and popular belief, if you like, popular culture doesn't let it just take hold. Things in history are not a straight line, nor a cycle even, but probably some kind of sinusoid. So that in this case, sort of, you know, there is a high point of reason, and then we have once again a kind of increasing mythology towards the time of Christianity. But that establishes the initial distance, if you like, which will be taken up by Western science, Western philosophy, and Western art. Right, I'm not going to talk about the Middle Ages. It would be too long. But in the Renaissance, I guess it would be fair to say that as opposed to the Middle Ages, which were ultimately theologically determined, where man's life really was not understood as a value in itself, but there was always a hope of eternal life, which was most important. As opposed to that position, the Renaissance, and I'm being very general, you know, I mean, I hope if you are some art historians or cultural historians here, you bear with me because it's very simplistic, but I think I have to do this to make a point. The Renaissance represents the first attempt to recognize that human experience, the world of man, was worth something, rather than being just a waiting state between this world and the next. So that cultural historians have called this the time of the beginning of liberation, yes, the adolescence of a liberated humanity, some cultural historian called it. Now, in a world like that, you know what happened. You know that suddenly architecture and the arts became liberal arts. They became very, very important. You probably know that Brunelleschi, a great architect in Florence, had an amazing funeral. The largest funeral ever in the history of Florence was for an architect. Can you imagine that today? Rather than a football player, right? But it happened, you know. And why did it happen? Well, because there was a real sense that somehow the configuration of the world of man was now in man's hands, and therefore these people were very important. The question of representing reality, like in the case of the painting, or making the world, the order of the world, like in the case of the architect who brought down the order of the heavens, always immutable to the world, always mutable of man, and made something truly significant appear through geometry and proportion. That work is considered to be of great importance. So that representation, particularly the dabblings in perspective of the 15th century, the representation of the world of man, the depth, has an amazingly evident ontological character. Yes, I mean, representation here acquires an ontological value. It's the revelation of being, that representation. This is why I find I haven't done anything, I promise. That's what I find the paintings of this art is absolutely wonderful, because they are all personal. Yes, I mean, what has to be realized here is that, at least from this sort of very rough reading, maybe you can bring it up. I guess from this reading, hopefully you can see that I lost completely my train of thought. That what is fundamental, what is very important, is the personal conveyance of this sense of depth. It's not a system. I guess this is what I was about to say. It's never systematized, and it is as fresh a discovery for the Renaissance as Cubism probably is still for us. Yes, I mean, this is not always there. The assumption that the world is a perspective, which is sort of take for granted because we identified with photography. I mean, that was a really novel thing in the Renaissance. It was a real discovery, right? And this is very crucial. I mean, try to see this. Every artist, therefore, particularly in the 15th century, before there is any systematization available, deploys these kinds of methods and layering and interest in representing the depth in very different ways. And that's why the painting of this period is so absolutely wonderful. I mean, it's really touching in that sense. a few more examples. I won't bother you with the names, but Botticelli and Uccello if you're interested. Okay, in the 16th century, as you can see very, very fast, the artists become more conversant with the methods, and they seem to dominate them more, and they tend to become more homogeneous. But what is very important about Renaissance perspective, and this is an illustration of Viator on the right and of Barbaro, of course it's the Dürer machine, but the woodcut comes from a treatise on perspective by Barbaro, published in the 16th century. What is very explicit is that still architecture doesn't accept perspective as an idea. And you're going to tell me, well, there are some exceptions. Obviously, Bramante did this kind of perspective illusion in Santa Maria presso San Satiro, and there are some exceptions. But overall, the architect is really not interested in perspective as an architectural idea. Perspective has to do with painting, because it is the ontological representation of depth in the plane that is fascinating. For the architect, what is important is to implement a geometrical order in the flesh, in a city which is still medieval in its fabric, and in a world that, as I said before, it's always changing and dying and being born and dying. It's not, I guess I should emphasize, a universe of precision. The Renaissance is still not the modern world, and therefore it is not a universe of precision. People are afraid of ghosts. There are ghosts, there are witches, there is no straightforward mechanistic explanation of phenomena that people take for granted. And therefore, the architects, when they try to make an order, they invoke those celestial orders that are constant in the sphere of the supralunar world. They invoke them really through talismanic influences. In fact, architects in the 16th century are very interested in magic. You may know about that by reading Francis Yates and a few other people, and make these propitiatory places for a human life, which is actually very insecure. The Renaissance is a very unsure time in spite of its wonderful art, and perhaps because of its wonderful art. I hope we are remembered that way. In about 300 years, they can say, well, the 20th century was a crisis. They were very unhappy, but they made wonderful art. Maybe they will. But the Renaissance was certainly the case, yes? And therefore, that's the modus operandi of the architect. So I must insist, in that work about perspective, it's very clear that Barbaro says perspective is for painters and for stage set designers, essentially. It has nothing to do with architecture. Architecture, he says, is about plan, section, and elevation. He includes a section now. So I think that is very important. I hope to prove why in a moment. These are two more treatises. One from late 16th century, where people actually, the guy goes mad. Yes, Stoer really is fascinated with the problem of revealing this geometrical structure of the world. And Vredeman de Vries on your right, which is exactly 1600, 1604, the date of this treatise, where the system is already much more under control. Much more, but it's still not altogether there. I mean, there are lots of issues that have not been resolved about how to construct perspective as a system. These two plates are also from de Vries. And two more. I guess these guys already calmed down. All right. Now, fully in the 17th century. We are now fully in the 17th century, yes? And we are fully in what I would call the Baroque world. Not so much as a stylistic description, but as a question of intentions. Now, what happens in Baroque is that, to put it very succinctly, perspective not only becomes an architectural idea, but becomes the fundamental architectural idea. From being rather marginal, now in the 17th century it becomes the central architectural idea. It's the idea which organizes everything else. And I think this is an amazing shift. Now, the perspective that is involved, for example, in that fresco, I hope you can see it clearly, the quadratura method, is quite amazing, because right under the, well, first of all, you can see how it involves a kind of Gesamtkunstwerke, yes, like the Germans say, a total work of art, which of course involves a sculpture, what we would call sculpture, yes, figures, involves painting and involves architecture, and you don't know where one ends and the other one begins. The issue, of course, is to create an illusion. It's an illusion which goes on top of that, and which, when you stand right under there, somewhere, I don't remember, somewhere around there, in a circle of bronze, which the architect very carefully places for you to stand, when you stand there and you look up, then once again you can dwell. You are part of a totality. The question is that man in the 17th century now has become slightly eccentric. It's no longer at the center. Yes, it's now slightly eccentric, and he must now occupy, for this illusion to work perfectly, exactly the point of view under that place. Now, in fact, in order to paint these things, as you may imagine, if you are inventive, the artist placed some candles exactly at the point where he was going to put his circle afterwards, and then put a grid of chords, whatever, you know, from at the springing of the vault, and with a little sketch, he sort of traced the distortion so that it would make sense. So that this is really a very different kind of perspective, right? I hope you understand what I mean. The Renaissance never ascribed you to a point of view. Now you have an architecture which makes sense fully only from one point of view. Not that you cannot perceive it from a different point of view, but there is a question of an order being revealed from one specific point of view. Now, why this shift? Well, I think this shift has to do with the whole set of cultural transformations that we normally call the scientific revolution, and that involves many people, but particularly two great protagonists of this are, of course, Galileo and Descartes. Now, Galileo and Descartes, the question that put very succinctly, again, please bear with me if you're specialists in the field, is that for the first time there is an assumption that a world which was organized hierarchically, where the world down here, as we said in the Renaissance, was always changing and mutable, and if you move this thing from here to there, it was really a different thing. So that the primacy of perception was a primacy of place, right? Note that. So that there was no space, really, it was place. For the first time now, Galileo says the same order that governs the sphere of the heavens up there governs what we do down here. The world of nature, he says, he writes, is written in mathematical terms. And only what we understand clearly and distinctly, only that which we understand clearly and distinctly, we can be certain that it's true. Everything else may be just an illusion, maybe just false. Now, this is an amazing inversion of priorities. I cannot deal with it in great detail, but I cannot emphasize this sufficiently, because we live today in a post-Galilean, post-Cartesian world in which these assumptions are taken for granted. We think the world is about numbers. We actually give greater importance to the average, the average temperature in Los Angeles in the month of October than actually what is out there and we can perceive. We give greater importance, I was saying this morning, to our measurement of, say, distance than to our perception of distance, when we know damn well that vertical distance is larger than horizontal distance. If you want to read about that, read Vandenberg, for Metabletic Reflections. So that he talks about this fascinating problem, right? That when you see a tower, you always overestimate. Yes, I mean, you always consistently overestimate where it would fall if it fell. And this is not an illusion. I mean, clearly it has something to do with the fact that we are vertical, and that our engagement in the world, the primary engagement, means that those distances are elastic. However, we don't believe that. We always believe that if we can measure this is 10 feet and this is 10 feet, it's identical, when it really isn't. and so forth and so on. You know, color is another very good example. I mean, where is color? What is white? What is red? What is yellow? You know, I mean, it depends whether it's morning, noon, or evening, and so forth and so on. But so that is an amazing inversion, a transformation, inversion of priorities, if you like, with regards to perception that occurs in the early 17th century. And Galileo is the main protagonist of this. So now Galileo says, I can imagine an object that moves in the vacuum. Gosh, well, imagine an object that moves in the vacuum, all right? And this object, if you don't touch it, if it's at rest, it will always be at rest. And if it's moving and it's in the vacuum and no other force acts upon it, it will keep at the same rate, moving exactly at the same speed. All right, the vacuum. I haven't seen it. Maybe you have. Maybe you have some friend physicists that has shown you the vacuum. I have never seen the vacuum. And the fascinating thing is that, of course, starting from that imaginative experiment, he builds up a set of assumptions about nature, which of course work. I mean, that's the key, right? I mean, and they have to be made to work. Thus, the question of technology, because if they are not shown to work, then it's useless. But what is worse is they become immediately extrapolated to other disciplines where they don't work. Yes, including architectural theory and architecture, I would claim in the 19th century. But so what does this guy have to do with this? Well, a lot, right? Really a lot. Because in the 17th century, in spite of this amazing transformation that is occurring, there is still a concern on the part of philosophers and scientists to somehow reconcile all that with tradition. So that when Descartes, for example, makes assumptions which are not very dissimilar to Galileo in the sense of the epistemological model, in the end, for example, he writes this complex book on physics, and in the end he says, well, you may not believe that every phenomenon in the world, from the way a dog sees to fire and human love, are the cause of vortexes of particles floating in midair. He says, but I have thought about it, I think about it clearly, and God would not fool me. Therefore, it must be true. Right? So, I mean, this is the 17th century, you have to realize. So there is an initial geometrization, very crucial, very important for the development of technology and the development of our own architecture. It's, in fact, perhaps the first ground for modern architecture. But at the same time, there is a concern on the part of architects and artists to reconcile the object and the subject, which has been separated finally by Descartes. Yes? And that happens precisely under that point. Yes? If I may be rhetoric. That's where man understands that God has created the world geometrically, and that this architect, acting like God through a geometrical device, organizing his whole work of illusion through geometry, through perspective, has created an illusion which is therefore a symbol of something larger than himself. So we are faced with a condition which is indeed the Baroque world, which has 1 foot here, 1 foot there, right? But for which perspective as an illusion becomes an authentic support for traditional ritual. So that's the story basically behind 17th century perspective. Now let me show you a few more examples about how this works. So that what is at issue here is, of course, the question of infinity. Infinity, which is always a problem, infinity which was never really conceived fully, except perhaps Nicola Cusano, before the 17th century, and which the 17th century has lots of problems with. In fact, for example, Descartes says that infinity is only for God, but that perhaps mathematics can only talk about indefinite space. But in any case, infinity becomes an issue, and the architect has to make it visible, has to make this space visible. For the first time, the question of what is between man and the world becomes an issue. Yes, because before Descartes thought about this model of reality being res cogitans, the substance that thinks, and res extensa, the objective world of mathematical relations. Before he put forward that model, that which was in between was never an issue. No one ever saw it. No one ever perceived it. No one was ever concerned with it. So architects are not concerned with space in that sense, right? Before these philosophers think about it. But after Descartes makes this separation, then the question of what is between the observer and the object becomes crucial. And this is a geometrical entity, and this geometrical entity is revealed through this perspective organization. And many other devices, of course, such as the use of light that you know about Baroque architecture, the question of placing elements like this, which is of course, but the fact of placing these bulk figures really rhetorically surrounded by space. I mean, we perhaps tend to believe that this was already a Roman invention. No, this is a Baroque invention, yes? And the evidence of this, of that which is between man and the world becomes the whole issue of architecture. So for the first time, I think we can authentically talk about space, even though, as I say in the beginning of the lecture, the architects never consciously talked about it. I've read the treatises, and I can tell you, I mean, you know, there is never a concern for space. But one can start to understand, read between the lines, understand the intentionality of this work in those terms. And this, of course, is a necessary step for the 19th century final consciousness of architecture as space, Schmarzov, and ultimately, I guess, the concern that gives, that is at the root of this lecture series. You know, I mean, this is really where it comes from. Another example of the same, another Quarentoris are special stage set designs for Easter. And then it's actually a photomontage on a painting of the period. So one of the issues, of course, of Baroque, which is rather disconcerting, is the question of illusion. And it's disconcerting because we think that today, when we are doing simulations, it's the same thing. And I would like to emphasize that it isn't. And hopefully the whole clarification of the problem that I have sort of presented to you in the beginning will be clear when that is fully understood. This is maybe an illusion, and indeed it is. You know, I mean, this you probably now know. But if you look at the light coming in, you know that this is not a dome, of course, right? I mean, this is painted. This is a Jesuit church in Vienna, and that's the nave. Now, this illusion, as I said before, supports ritual. The ritual is not excluded from this whole affair in the way in which modernity excludes ritual from the city. You know, so, I mean, this is a very important consideration. I think hopefully you'll see why in a moment. Another instance of 17th century perspective that you may be familiar with or not, but is very fascinating, is anamorphosis. Anamorphosis is this distortion. Yes, if you placed, well, this is some work of one of my Houston students long ago, who worked with that idea, and I'm using it simply as an example. If you would place that cylinder over there, then that cylinder would reconstitute that thing around there into that picture, right? So you would actually be seeing that picture on the cylinder. Yes, like you now see the cubes, which are actually distorted and drawn around the cylinder. Now, the interest about anamorphosis is oh, well, let me just show you another example of there were many kinds of anamorphosis, conical, cylindrical. This is a flat one. There were actually a number of frescoes painted, one of them in Santa Trinità dei Monti, behind the Spanish Steps in Rome, that were actually like that. They were distorted from the front, and the only way to make sense of the painting was if you looked along the wall, right? I mean, I cannot really move very much because this will get disconnected. But if you look along the screen from that side, of course, then you would get a revelation of what is being painted. Now, why is this important? Well, anamorphosis is particularly important, I think, because in the early 17th century, it was not a trick. It was a form of perspective which was identified with mechanics. And this man, Salomon de Caus, I don't know if you can read his name, wrote a book about this problem of anamorphosis and identified it with these mechanics, which he actually understood as mechanical marvels. Yes, this guy, for example, would have, this is the device in the pedestal, and when the sun came up, it would hit the water hermetically sealed in there, it would increase the pressure, and it would blow a melody. Right? So that's mechanics for you in the 17th century, or that fountain. They were not very interested in utilitarian stuff. One of these, Salomon de Caus then makes this connection between mechanics and anamorphosis. And he says that anamorphosis, and there are a number of other people that talk in the same way, Niceron is another one, that anamorphosis you have to be very careful with because it's a form of magic. Because you are actually tampering with the order of the world by distorting the image. Now, today, in our world of simulations, we don't realize any of that, right? For us, that makes absolutely no sense. In fact, that's really the problem we have, this total disarticulation of form and content, which we believe has always been the case. That architects and artists have always thought of form and content as separate things. Well, in fact, it was very tough to separate them in the first place. And one of the first instances in which this happens is in the question of anamorphosis. So it's fascinating to find that by changing the world formally, you're actually doing some kind of violence to the world. And it's like black magic. You have to be very careful, they say. Right? So that's the interest with anamorphosis. Eventually, about 30 years later, these tricks become scientific curiosities. Right? And at that point, it becomes very clear that you can distort the appearance without actually changing the object, without actually changing the world. So that I guess put in a different way, in the traditional world, the presence, the undistorted presence, had to have primacy over any kind of distorted appearance. Yes, you could not distort through the appearance something of the world because it was making violence upon it. So it's very interesting to see how this becomes so, finally disarticulated. They go separate ways, if you like, form and content, and now you can formally operate upon the world without really believing that you are changing its essence, that you are changing anything significant. During this period, of course, how the question of perspective becomes an architectural idea is very clear in the gardens, in the palaces, as well as in the churches. I just want to show you, this is Heidelberg, a place where Salomon de Caus worked, the man that I was just talking about. He made those gardens of the palace of the Heidelberg castle. And of course, the reality of the Baroque garden is a very different reality because it's no longer finite, like the Renaissance garden used to be. It's now open, it's dominant, and one could perhaps say that the 17th century, after the Renaissance, liberates man. In the 17th century, man becomes intoxicated with power. For the first time, man is intoxicated with power, and the way in which he implements this power is in the 17th century in a kind of reconciliatory mood. He still is worried about dominating the world of nature. He still is worried about the world which he has not created. So it's not fully fledged technology yet, right? I mean, there is a question of somehow reconciling that power with the world as given. I guess a significant footnote about all this, you may know, I mentioned this in my book actually, that even though in the 17th century, as you probably know, infinitesimal calculus is discovered by Leibniz and Newton almost simultaneously, it's never used as a tool until the 19th century. Because people are genuinely worried about manipulating infinity. As late as 1797, There is a book written by Lazare Carnot on differential calculus saying, I mean, come on, use it. You know, I mean, you can use it. You don't have to understand it. As long as it works, it's okay. Right? So it's really tremendous effort to dissociate the two spheres. That's Heidelberg. That's what remains of Salomon de Caus's amazingly humorous work. This is one of the giants that wanted to climb Olympus. It's a bit drunk, actually. It's not very heroic. Another example of this reconciliatory domination of 17th century architecture, you know, the understanding that the architect works like God by creating almost a new order is very clear in Isola Bella, yes, where the whole island really has the appearance of being totally acknowledged from beginning to end, you know, as if it were this amazing monster coming from under the water, or a boat, or I mean, there are 100 metaphors that could be applied. Those are the two extremes, right? Of the. You should go, by the way. I mean, you have this program over there. I'm sure you visit it all the time, so I shouldn't even say that. I'm sure it's familiar territory for you. And perhaps the most extreme example that I can show you of this is Caserta, near Naples. I mean, it's really in very bad shape now, in fact, because the gardens were far more complex than the iconographic programs. All that is gone. But this is actually taken with a telephoto. So it's already, you know, sort of amazingly foreshortened. And the water starts up there in the middle of the hill, right? And so if you remember, I mean, this is actually, when you went into Versailles, and you had to face infinity first before you went up the stairs to go about your business in the court. And of course, you know, we sort of become very sometimes irritated with this kind of thing, with the art historians talk about how nasty these kind of autocratic rulers were because they sort of dominated the world and so forth. Well, you know, I don't think one can be so simplistic. I mean, remember that the wine used to freeze in the glass of Louis XIV. So if it wasn't very comfortable there, it was all about making an order, and it was very important that this order worked for everybody. I mean, I'm not saying that the peasants were not exploited. They probably were, like they are today. But the question is not comfort. The question is a symbolic order, and this was established, whether it be in a religious building or a profane building like this, always through the idea of perspective, which had transcendental overtones. Ultimately, the king spoke for God. It was the embodiment of order, and the institution was, you know, acknowledged. Okay. All right. Towards the end of the 17th century, increasingly perspective becomes just the truth of the world. Nothing else, nothing more. It's like someone wrote, it's like if you put the mirror in front of something ugly, it's ugly. If you put the mirror in front of something beautiful, it's beautiful. It has no value, right? So suddenly it becomes, but of course it has tremendous values. I mean, it becomes pregnant with value, if you like, from the back door. But it supposedly has no value. It becomes a neutral representation of the truth of the world. That's the assumption. Of course, that is very much emphasized in Dutch painting, which, of course, as you know, emphasizes bourgeois sort of values, the merchants in Holland. And towards the end of the 17th century, we finally have, and please mark my words, because it didn't exist before, we finally have a method in which you can actually start with that and end with that, which is the way I was taught perspective, right? In the 17th century, a number of people tried to teach perspective at the École des Beaux-Arts. Well, what was then was the Academy, yes? The Academy of Painting. And they failed terribly because the painters rebelled, particularly with a disciple of Desargues, who was a very modern man who invented a method of perspective that you could actually work mathematically. He was really about 150 years beyond his time. Nobody could understand him. But his disciple, Boss, tried to teach this method to the painters, which was actually very good. Methodically, it was perfect. The painters sacked him, right? Because they just didn't believe that it was possible, and they weren't interested. They had to learn it empirically. Okay, in the 17th century. But towards the end of the 17th century, we finally have this, which is a very famous treatise by Andrea Pozzo, that gets translated into English right away, and which is very systematic, and which is perhaps the first real attempt to understand perspective as a tool of reduction. Yes, this is simply the way that reality looks. It has no values of its own. It's no longer the symbolic order of the world. Okay, it's very important to realize that. It's identified with the way reality is presented, period. Another example of how that has an impact in architecture, that notion, is perhaps clear in this treatise by Ferdinando Galli Bibbiena, who is in the tradition of a long family of stage set designers and architects, who writes this book in 1711, I believe that is, where he says architecture, civil is always added because it's not military, prepared on geometry, you know, based on geometry, and reduced to perspective. Yes, practical considerations, etc., etc., etc. Now, in this book, Ferdinando Galli Bibbiena finally, and I must insist finally, because art historians get very confused with this and they think that it happened before. I don't think it did. Finally identifies architecture and theater. Yes? So when one talks about urban spaces that are theatrical and making stage sets in the city, I think one must really refer to the 18th century. And there are other reasons that I would give you for that. And I would recommend you read Richard Sennett for that, The Fall of Public Man. I think it's very good. But in any case, this guy makes that assumption. He teaches geometry. He then teaches the classical orders. He teaches how to do perspective very simply. And then he comes to the substance of the whole thing, which is what he has discovered. And what he has discovered is actually quite interesting. It's called perspectiva per angolo in Italian. For us, it's two-point perspective. Big deal, right? But it is really, once again, an amazing discovery. From the centralized condition of the perspective of the Baroque, where you had to occupy that privileged position to understand that order in the world and recover your central position once the car had kicked you out a little bit. Yes? From that condition, now you have a kind of perspective that homogenizes space. So that now if you go to the theater, you don't have to sit in the central box to have that privileged access to reality. You can sit anywhere in the theater, and it's the same. So it's very interesting because the assumption really, I mean, the key here is that line. That line becomes very important because that line becomes diluted, right? And that condition becomes extended. And I would put it to you that ever since, there is the belief, popular belief, that we actually live in a perspective world. So that when we go to a museum with our parents particularly, I can talk about myself, I don't have to hang it on any of you, you know, if we go and we see a painting that doesn't have a correct perspective, my father might say, gee, you know, I mean, I think you paint better than that. Maybe even I could do it better, right? Why? Because there is this assumption that reality is perspective. Where does that come from? It's really very weird. Because if you think about it, the world as we are engaged in it, primordially synesthetically, not through the senses and then somehow in our mind, boom, 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 meaning, but in our engagement as embodied beings in the world is not a perspective. Far from it. Right? And that is why, let me go a little bit further ahead. Okay, let me suspend that for a moment. It's coming up. maybe I can conclude the sentence and anyhow go back to it. That is why Euclidean geometry was always the geometry of architects until the end of the 18th century. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Euclidean geometry has the residue of embodied experience. You want to call it intuition, call it intuition. But has that residue. It's part of the geometry. This is why Euclid could never believe that lines met at a point in infinity. If you remember your high school geometry, the point of departure of Euclidean geometry is that parallel lines never meet. Remember? Well, at this moment in time, when Bellotto is painting his vistas of Europe, there is a mathematician, an Italian mathematician by the name of Saccheri, who, according to every account that I have read on the history of mathematics and history of science, he had all the tools at his disposal to prove that Euclid was wrong. That somehow he could actually overcome that hurdle. I mean, they call it hurdle. That parallel lines do meet at a point in infinity, but he didn't do it. In a very mysterious way, he just backed off. He never went ahead because he probably couldn't believe it. Because in fact, parallel lines don't meet. Primordially, they don't meet. They meet in a visible world. In the world of vision, they meet. But that is already a reduction of the primary world, where reality is given. Right? And that's hopefully going to be clarifying that inversion I was talking about. All right. Generally, however, the 18th century, for 100 years, suspends its interest in geometry for very complex reasons. One being, of course, the discovery of Newton, where he claims that by observing nature through induction, he has arrived at the law of universal gravitation, and he doesn't need to make any geometrical hypothesis. So he criticizes Descartes and criticizes all the people that wrote in the 17th century these a prioristic systems which were geometrized. The 18th century, therefore, puts forward this condition which Yvonne Belavar has called the arresting of the geometrization of the world. Rousseau, in fact, went on record, he wrote something like, in a few years more, there won't be even 3 geometricians left in Europe. He thought that geometry had reached its limit and that somehow knowledge had to follow a very different route. It's interesting if you think about it, because we think of Rousseau as part of the Enlightenment somehow. You know what I mean? These people are reasonable. Why would they have thought that way? So not surprisingly, the architects were also not concerned with geometry. They were not concerned with the domination of the world anymore. If you look at Gainsborough, or look on your right, or look at Batty Langley's plate for the making of an English garden, the tools of the gardener, the geometry is used as a tool, but is used to create a reality which is similar to the painting, right? So that the English garden, of which this is a good example, Storehead, becomes as natural as possible. The implication here is that the architect and the artist should let nature be what it is, because by observing it, somehow the presence of God is revealed. The constants that are revealed through induction in the Newtonian method are ultimately related to this interest in coming closer to divinity. We all know that now, but of course high school teachers normally ignore this when they talk about Newton. So that Newton, as many philosophers and historians of science have pointed out, did make a couple of very, very crucial hypotheses. Absolute time and space, right? Which in fact, in the Principia Naturalis Philosophia Mathematica, he equates with God. So that when he reveals the structure of the world formulated in one universal law, universal gravitation, he's actually convinced that this is a manifestation of God. And of course we know Newton was interested in alchemy and the Temple of Jerusalem and many other things, but this is a very important consideration, because it's part of the science that then went to have a tremendous influence over every conceivable intellectual and architect and artist in Europe. So that because of that, the phenomenon of the English garden comes about, and because of that, I think there is a suspension ultimately in the interest of dominating nature. Yes, technology again doesn't take hold because somehow nature is sacred. It's still sacred. It's still more evident in the 18th century than it was in the 17th century. We have to let it be what it is. So when an art historian tells me that somehow that, because it has proportions, is very different in nature from the romanticism of the English garden, I become very nervous. I think it's false. I think that in the 18th century, in fact, both were reconciled. Marjorie Hope Nicholson has written a wonderful book about called "Newton Demands the Muse," in which she talks about how Newton influenced the poets. And in fact, you know, that condition of a science which has a poetic dimension and a poetry which, of course, draws for its meaning from science, which was philosophy, that continuity of knowledge is still very much there in the 18th century, even in the age of reason. It will only break down finally in the 19th. So this is very clear, I think, in the English garden and in 18th century architecture. Another phenomenon of 18th century architecture, which I cannot really even, I will simply mention it. I mention one aspect of it, but which is interesting in our conversation, is Rococo, so-called Rococo architecture, particularly the southern German variety of Rococo. It's particularly interesting because now the architecture has become totally self-referential, if I may use that term. The perspective no longer relates to man on the floor and that circle of the Baroque church. The perspective now, the point of perspective is shifted away from man. Always, consistently it's lifted. And the spectacle becomes, I mean, the building itself becomes the spectacle. The building itself becomes the ritual. If you go to Weltenberg, for example, or any of these amazing Rococo churches, you find, you know, for instance, the resurrection of the Virgin, you know, where the sepulchre actually opens up and there's this figure floating in midair and the angels floating, you know. It's really an amazingly never before seen representation of the mystery, which almost takes the place of the ritual, almost implies that the ritual is no longer possible. And I think from the point of view of perspective, it's very significant that it is lifted and becomes sort of self-referential. Now, I think that for our purposes, from the point of when we talk about the work of contemporary architects and the realm of post-perspectivity, I think that the beginning of it all is probably Piranesi. Particularly the carceri, the second stage of the carceri, the way Eisenstein talks about it, the exploded state, where this architetto veneziano, who built only one building in his life, not for lack of commissions, but because he probably wasn't very interested. You know, he was much more interested in doing his architecture in other media. This architetto veneziano actually creates an architecture which is perceptually possible, but impossible to build. Like if you try to make a model of this, it's very difficult in slides. You really have to look at it very carefully, because that's the point. These things are unbuildable. They are actually hermetically sealed. You can really not penetrate them. You can only penetrate them with a different body than the classical body. It's already a different body from the body of Cartesianism. It's already a body which probably has more to do with Giambattista Vico's philosophy, which had a lot of influence, I believe, on Piranesi, which is a whole question of history as the science of man and mythology and a number of things that I won't get into, than with the more banal aspects of modernity. So that by taking that consideration, I think that this architecture starts to show a full comprehension of the potential of modernity. As the possibility of making mystery, of making fascination, of making enigma appears only in the drawing in this manner, by in fact denying entry, while at the same time inviting it. This, of course, if you like, is you can perhaps think of this as proto-cubist or proto-modern or whatever you want, proto-whatever. But ultimately, I think that happening in the 18th century, when it did, it's perhaps the first instance of an architect who's very conscious of what he's doing, and, you know, making these etchings, which of course has a very complex iconographical program, being prisons and so forth and so on. Lots has been written about it, and which make a criticism of the world in which it is no longer possible, perhaps, to build architecture for reasons that are beyond the control of the architect, because of the assumptions that have filtered down to society about what is value. Yes, and of course that will become much more clear in the 19th century with technological worldview, when the only thing which is valuable is that which is efficient and economic, and beyond that hardly anything gets built, right? So that concern, I think, is very clear here in this architecture, which is at the same time poetic and critical, and this is very important. Octavio Paz makes this very interesting. Has this very interesting thought about modern poetry. He's saying any form of modern poetry, he says, after the shattering of the cosmos in the late 18th century, cannot be only poetic. It has to be a criticism. It has to be both. All right. So the last architect that can perhaps have the luxury, well, there are a couple, but Ledoux and Boulez have perhaps the luxury of still believing that the geometrical forms that they are using are the forms of nature. I mean, if you read Ledoux, it's very obvious this is what it's all about. You know, that somehow by revealing the geometry of nature, which is the geometry of a building such as the one you have on your right, you're actually manifesting the order of God. I mean, he quotes God all the time, Ledoux. For him, it's very important. By the same token, one must emphasize, this is perhaps the last instance in which this kind of perspective representation occurs in the realm of Euclidean geometry. This is very crucial. I said a little bit about Euclidean geometry before, but if you remember, you may have read, or there are a number of people, Cassirer talks about it, Ortega-Gasset talks about it as well. They both talk about Euclidean geometry, and they insist that in Euclidean geometry, you need the figure, the idea, the figure, right? In order to make any demonstration. If you're talking about a square, you need the square. And the square is ultimately an intuition. It's in the world. It's part of that constant dimension of embodied experience. So that as long as the geometry is Euclidean, let me put it this way, as long as the assumption is that parallel lines don't meet, because the tactile, the embodied, is primary, as long as that remains, there is always a concrete residue of the geometry which allows for meaning. So that you can make these abstract formal manipulations, but you can still expect, like I think he did, and in a very reasonable way, that these things speak, that they are meaningful, that they have, hold their own ground in that sense. They are not formal games. However, and let me go one first and then come back. In the beginning of the 19th century, that Euclidean geometry finally is put into question, let's put it that way. The way it's put into question is first by a man whose name is Gaspard Monge in the École Polytechnique. As you probably know, the first modern school of architecture. The fundamental discipline was this new geometry called descriptive geometry, which is exemplified on your left, and which implied, to put it simply, that you could reduce systematically any object of three-dimensional experience to the world of two dimensions. So that now you need no longer have the experience. You need no longer have the experience of building. You could sit in your office and draw very precise working drawings. Right? I mean, we take this for granted. We think that the architect has always operated in the same way. No, by no means. The architect traditionally, before this happened, was always involved in making And the value of the drawing was probably much more symbolic in that sense, embodiment of an idea, than a reduction of that other reality which had to emerge when this thing changed scale and became a material object. But that changes with this tool. This tool, and I don't think I exaggerate, I'm quoting Hayek and a number of people in this regard, this tool becomes a fundamental mental tool for the development of the Industrial Revolution. Without it, no matter how many proletariats and forces of all kinds may have emerged in the world, and looms may have been built in England, without it, the Industrial Revolution simply could not have been possible. Fundamental tool that allows the reduction, as I said, of the three-dimensional world to the drafting table. It's very important. It's very important. It creates tremendous confusion, because now when we teach, and I don't know what you guys get here, but clearly I always have this problem with my faculty, because they think that when I was the head of that school, they never had the patience to hear a lecture like this. So when they think that, well, they think that I'm not interested in construction, right? I'm suspicious of construction because I'm suspicious of courses that deal with building science. Well, hopefully you can understand why I might be. Yes, because in fact building science and the assumption that you reduce this thing to a set of a kit of parts and working drawings is the worst thing that could have ever happened to architecture. Because in fact it stops the architect from actually being a builder. Right? So it's a fundamental inversion of terminology, of implications, and everything is turned upside down. Theory suddenly becomes a methodology and is purged from any kind of mythical or metaphysical concern. Everything is turned sort of inside out, creating tremendous confusion because sometimes the terms remain the same and then we don't know where we stand. So that is fundamental tool. It's the tool of Durand. On the right, you have projective geometry. Projective geometry was simply an offshoot of descriptive geometry. It was a systematization written by Poncelet in the 1820s, in which all these intuitions about the world, which constituted the ground of geometry, are now reduced to algebra. You now no longer need to have an idea, which is an image, to do geometry. Now if you're a geometrician, all you need to know is that, believe it or not. That's all. That reduces the whole world of geometry according to projective geometry. Everything becomes a variation of a system of converging lines that always converge at a point in infinity. If you start by assuming that that is reality, then you can prove anything you ever wanted to prove about any geometrical figure in the world, and you don't even have to imagine it. You can do it with numbers. Right? So I mean, it's a very different geometry. And that's the world, of course, in which analytical mechanics, for example, operate. Mechanics is a similar example. Mechanics used to be always full. If you look at treatises of mechanics in the 17th century or the 18th century, they're always full of images. In the beginning of the 19th century, they are purged from images. Everything becomes formulas. And finally, you have the possibility of writing treatises such as Durand, and let me now go back to that. And this is a plate from Durand, or any number of other treatises dealing with problems of making buildings, where you actually reduce the whole building operation to a set of recipes. To a set of recipes which are perfectly controllable, which you can supposedly teach in school, right? You don't really have to be involved with the masons anymore. You don't have to know anything about wood in order to be able to design a detail, because you have supposedly the tools of geometry that allows you to do anything you want. And ultimately, like for example, there is a book at that time on bridges, which finally tells you how to design a bridge, reducing all the complex reality of the world that has to do with building a bridge to a mathematical formula. Yes, variables, coefficients, etc. Now we know that some bridges have failed ever since because someone forgot some variable, which I'm sure if you know this, I don't know if you have seen this film that every architecture student gets, this bridge that someone forgot that there was wind, right? And so it collapsed. I mean, this is of course an exaggeration, but it happened. I mean, it was quite a blunder. I suppose that it cost a few $1 million. And it really has to do with the sense that somehow we can reduce experience to a set of variables mathematically, and thus control the whole building the whole building project from inception to conclusion. That, I must emphasize, never happened before the beginning of the 19th century. In the work of Durand, and this is the only plate in his work in which there is any perspective. He felt very insecure about it. He felt that it represented too much the way the world was, so he purified everything, and from those lavish drawings of Durand, of Boulez and Ledoux, we have only line drawings now, yes? That's the way all the work of Durand is. In his work, he finally, as I point out in my book, he purifies theory from myth. He sort of kicks myth in the butt, kisses it goodbye, and tries to somehow constitute theory in a purely rational basis. And he says that theory of architecture has nothing to do with philosophy, that architecture has nothing to do with art, because it has nothing to do with imitation. And essentially he makes an attempt to postulate an autonomous architecture, which of course is doomed to failure, because a theory without that metaphysical content cannot be a normative thought. It can only be a method. And this is really what happens with his work. At the same time, I always tell this anecdote because it's very important and I think very graphic. You have the work of Laplace, who continues on the footsteps of Newton, and who apparently was asked by Napoleon, Monsieur Laplace, you've written a work on astronomy and the cosmos. Why don't you mention God? And so he answered, as you probably know, Monsieur l'Impérateur, because I have no need of such a hypothesis. Right? I don't need the hypothesis. So why the hell mention God? So from that time onwards, lots of things happen. Knowledge becomes specialized, compartmentalized. There is no longer the sense that somehow philosophy is a philosophy of something. Even that has become specialized, has to become. Whereas it was always philosophy of something, because it was always an integral understanding of the world. You have endless sort of complications that derive from that problem, which have to do with an obsession for objectivity, coupled with a belief that all that man has access to is always his subjectivity. This final split of the world into the utterly objective and the utterly subjective, which hopefully modern philosophy has overcome, but which still, I think, hampers at a popular level our understanding of the potential of modernity. Certainly architects, like, well, I mean, you call him architect, like Haussmann in his planning of Paris, have latched onto certain aspects of modernity, but I think the main failure of so-called modern architecture has been not to understand the full potential of modernity in the way that other artists have. And these other artists, I guess, from very early on, have operated in that realm of post-perspectivity. If I may jump 100 years now and show you De Chirico and Juan Gris, two very different artists, of course, dealing in supposedly very different paradigms, but which, in my opinion, reveal profound realities about architecture precisely in spite of the medium, precisely by moving in a realm that is a non-perspective realm, yes? So that they take the bull by the horns, while the architect sort of gets caught and insists that he must build in the world of perspective, in a world which is now a prosaic world of perspective, which is a delusion. Yes, the city, as you know, after Haussmann was finished, was no longer a place which supported ritual. It became a place for the voyeur, like Benjamin talks about it, and ultimately becomes extremely problematic in terms of supporting the work, because the assumptions are really the assumptions of a perspective world. The reality is a perspective reality and nothing else. However, I think that even in architecture, and perhaps we can have some questions in the end, so I'm going to hurry. Even in architecture, there are people that have moved in this realm. I want to give you two very different examples on purpose. One would be Gaudí, yes, the chapel in Colonia Well. Just very briefly, just to sort of provoke you, perhaps. Perhaps you understand very well what I'm trying to say. And the other would be none other than our beloved Corb in La Tourette. And I would claim that both these buildings, even though they are very different, they are profound realizations that, if you remember my two slides of Gris and the Chirico, have much to do with the realizations of those two, well, not precisely those two painters, but the general understanding of vision that these two kinds of painting embody. So that there is, if you like, kind of coming to terms with the question of abstraction, not shying away from it. Man is certainly a visionary. He has to take responsibility for his acts. There is no way to go back. We cannot recreate the myths of the past. We have to deal with our own fragmented mythologies, whether we like it or not. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is, of course, that we can recover meanings from the world by revealing their profoundly enigmatic condition, which is, of course, the Chirico paradigm, the paradigm of surrealism, which I believe both Gaudí and certainly also Corb, although this has been less talked about, were very interested in. So there is a whole question of reversal of expectations, of taking something which is very traditional in a way, like a monastery, and turning it really upside down. Rather than grounded, it's up in the air. Rather than being light when it's transparent, it's very dark. Rather than being open to the center like any cloister, it's hermetically closed. The center is inaccessible. Making all sorts of inversions and tensions that reveal the openness of man to nothingness, if you like, the presence of the abyss, as I said in the beginning of the lecture. In fact, we had a wonderful conversation. I spent about 4 or 5 days in La Tourette. And we had a wonderful conversation with a Dominican man who had lived there all his life and saw it from its beginning. And he was saying some beautiful things. I mean, he was really clever. He actually understood very well what it was all about. He said that the building was far more spiritual than they could ever stand. That there was no building in the whole order of the Dominicans that came even remotely close to the demands on spirituality that this building made. He said it's infinitely complex. And the plan is very simple. I don't have it with me. But it's infinitely complex. It's always mysterious. And it always has a kind of reticence for ritual. It sort of excludes ritual. If you go to the church, it's like everything is closing in. I had this feeling. If you look at the picture previous, you have a sense, and also from the outside, that these little pieces of concrete are going to be sort of taken away and closed. And that, of course, stops you from looking out. Yes? And everything is, this is very serious, actually. And the lid is about to close. Yes? And the cross, even though and you can barely see it, even though it's symmetrical, it appears asymmetrical. I mean, if you measure it, it's symmetrical. But if you are there, it is asymmetrical. And it's fantastic that Corb made all these games, and he actually convinced them that it was a very Catholic church. And it's actually a complete reverse. I mean, you know what that is? That's a confessional, painted red, right? In the back of if you've ever been in a Catholic church. I mean, I don't know it's fantastic. Nobody really talks about this place like that, and it always annoys me. I'm not a Corb specialist, but it's so explicit what is happening here. The altars for the young priests, it was a seminary that are on a lower level. They are also very interesting sort of reversals, because these altars in a normal church always imply a congregation, even if the priest who has to say a mass every day, doesn't have a congregation. The congregation is implied. Well, here it's reversed again. What is behind the altar is this undulating wall which is about to collapse on top of the priest. All that the priest has is his altar, and he can look up. It's all between him and God. It's a personal problem. It's no longer a problem of ritual. And and so that this place, I mean, how can anyone say that it's not figural, right? I mean, if Michael Graves, whom you will have here very soon, I was telling our friends that I'm honored to be in the list, but with such a distinguished person. But he will say, he would actually claim that this is abstract. And I don't understand it. I mean, in the way in which he means it. But in any case, these are two, I hope, very different, but hopefully clear examples of what I mean. These two buildings actually managed to take the bull by the horns. However, just to finish my case, I'd like to emphasize that there are few buildings like that, really quite few, and that really, that embody an architecture in the traditional sense of the word, in the traditional sense of what is an architectural idea, in the way I try to define it for you through history, that which keeps it constant. I've always found, as I said in the beginning, that probably work like this, Giacometti's, is perhaps closer to dealing with those issues because it's freer, obviously. It's freer, but of course that doesn't mean that it's easier. It's freer of the hang-ups, really, of what we think professional architecture should be. And that's what perhaps is irritating. Hopefully, times are changing. But I think this architecture, by the way, and I could take devil's advocate. I would really take a very risky position and say that I believe that after the dissolution of the cosmos in the late 18th century, most of what has been valuable in art, no matter the medium, has architectural implications at least. I mean, I may be crucified, and some people say that I'm simply modeling the issues because why talk like that? Why model the issue? I mean, painting is painting, it's canvas and paint. Sculpture is sort of sculpture, Well, I don't think it's so simple. It certainly wasn't simple like that in history. Of course, there is a question of medium, no question about it. But if you think, for example, of the continuum in Michelangelo's work and how he thought of his architecture in relation to his painting and his sculpture as the most abstract of a continuous expression, where the buildings are actually about flesh and tensions, I think that it's very clear that for him there is no such a distinction. And I think we may have too many hang-ups around that as well. Work that I respect profoundly and that I believe proves my point very well is John Haydock's, particularly his late work. And I think that the famous structures that were built in Berlin out of the Mask project, I think are very fascinating, mainly because they show that their meaning doesn't change when the scale changes. And I'm very fascinated by that. I think that has something to do with the fact that they were created in a space which is not a perspective space. In a way, let me put it in a different way, it doesn't matter if it gets built or not. Right? The architecture is there. This doesn't change it one bit. And that is, for me, what modern architecture really is all about. Operating in a post-perspective world, operating in a world which is no longer the world of the modern prejudices of the 17th century. Finally, just very briefly, a little piece of student work, which is, you probably haven't seen, just like a suite from one student of mine in Carleton, who was, the whole thesis actually about the problem of perspective. This is one semester work, and then there is another semester which I won't show you. It's very fragmented, but dealing with Venice. But she actually looked at the Chirico and Raymond Roussel and Rossi, of course, and tried to look at the problem of perspective as an issue and the question of architecture, theater as a paradigmatic architectural space, and what it all meant in history. Anyhow, just very briefly, these were some initial explorations, drawings, which of course have the point of departure in De Chirico. She also took De Chirico's writings very seriously. And she actually made a painting, which is on the left, for the writings, and she wrote poems for the paintings. That was the point of departure. And then made these drawings. And it all became a kind of personal exploration of relevant fragments, personal memories. I think that we are condemned to that. And I really believe very much that the only way out of this dilemma is believing that we must come to terms with the problem of knowledge here and now, not expect that somebody else does it for us, and that we must take the bull by the horns and realize that by taking contextual positions, typological positions, and all that junk, we are not getting anywhere, that we are simply fogging the issue, that of course, modern architecture has done horrible harm to the city, but that most of the time it has really very little to do with architecture anyhow, so why feel guilty? We have this terrible guilty conscience, so we cannot touch anything, we have to keep every old building, and that's horrible, because although I understand the problem, I also believe that unless one realizes that the tradition of architecture is made out of visions, of personal visions, grounded in the world through a cultural diagnosis, we will never make a wonderful architecture. So I guess that's what I emphasize to my students, and I think this embodies it quite beautifully. This is a big model that, of course, is a kind of anti-perspective, where everything gets flattened from this side. I think it's perfectly evident. And there are, of course, very simple orders of necessity, she calls it, and freedom on the top. These are the two side elevations. And then finally, a night view and the plan, which is a happy discovery. It was never drawn. And this is the other aspect that I would like to emphasize. Have faith in what you make, because one actually thinks with one's hands. The question of theory is not a question of method, it's not a question of how it can be applied. That is irrelevant. It's the thoughts you think, the way you understand yourself, and then what you make. The connection is you, because you are not just mind, you are embodied, and you think with your hands. And I think that as long as you understand this, the work opens up a kind of hope, becomes a hopeful reality, which in itself deconstructs nihilism, and I'm profoundly happy about that. Maybe I can just leave you with a wonderful quotation that I always use when I've been to a certain place for the first time, by Goethe, who of course wrote a fantastic book about modernity, Faust, yes? He said, "The highest to which man may aspire is wonder." Thank you very much.
So instead of questions, catch him at the reception.
I'll be there. I think it's better rather than keep you here, because it's already been 2 hours.
Alberto, Nils Spinning. Nice to see you. Nice to see you.
I think so. I don't know. The dean was here, was the dean when he announced, because that's right now, yes, that may be.